officially get started. Thank you everyone to joining us today for our workshop presentation on free, prior, and informed consent. Before we get started, I just wanted to give folks some reminders about Zoom. If you have any questions that arise during our session today, please put them in the Q&A box that's located at the bottom of your screen. We don't have a dedicated Q&A portion today, but we will be addressing questions throughout with time permitting. And as we get started today, I just want to encourage folks to share their name, their organization, and location in the chat. We would love to know who we have joining us today. If you run into any issues or if you're disconnected for whatever reason, you can rejoin this session using the Zoom link provided in your confirmation and your reminder emails. So my name is Samantha Miller, and I'm going to be your host for today. I serve as the communications manager for our community-based conservation programs here at National Wildlife Federation. I am based in DC currently. I am also joined today by my colleague Anjali Thakur, who is our community habitat coordinator, and she is based out of St. Paul, Minnesota. So we have a lot to cover in today's session, and I'm going to give folks a brief introduction into what you should expect for today. So we are going to begin by grounding ourselves in why this conversation and workshop is important. We will be joined by NWF's Free, Prior, and Informed Consent Manager, Jon Naranjo, who will introduce the principles of free, prior, and informed consent and discuss NWF's Tribal and Indigenous Partnership Enhancement Strategy. My coworker Anjali will then take us through a special workshop session that we've designed before we wrap up and conclude for today. And before I continue, I'll let folks know that we'll be using FPIC and free, prior, and informed consent throughout the webinar. So if you hear FPIC, that's what that stands for. So the goal of this webinar today is to introduce all of you and our community partners to the Indigenous principles and practices of free, prior, and informed consent, as well as the implementation of FPIC. So we hope you leave here today with a deeper understanding of what FPIC is, its origins, and its importance to Indigenous peoples. We also hope that people leave this session with a deeper understanding of best practices for implementing free, prior, and informed consent, and we hope you feel empowered to continue your personal education on the history of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island and to adopt the principles and practices in the community conservation work that you may be leading. So you may be curious as to why we are talking about FPIC as environmentalists, conservationists, community organizers, and natural resources practitioners. And it's because we recognize that Indigenous peoples are the original stewards of this land. And considering the history of forced land removals and the subsequent resistance, environmentalists of all trades, it's our duty to consider how we approach and engage tribes and Indigenous communities in the work that we're leading. So I think all of us here can relate to how deeply a person can feel connected to the land where they live, learn, play, or worship. It shapes our families, our identities, our memories, and quite often our childhoods. And this is immensely true for Indigenous peoples and communities, as the land is in an ongoing relationship and shaping communities' relationships to medicine, ceremonies, and many more things that you see on your screen here. So before we dive into the next portion of our session featuring Jon Naranjo, I just want to ask folks that are joining us today to just reflect on a piece of land that you love. Think about what comes to mind when you think of it and how it connects to who you are. And if you have the ability, definitely share that out in the chat. We want to be able to kind of get an understanding of where folks are and what land has value to them. And of course, if there are any questions that come up during Jon's portion, remember to just put them in the Q&A portion and we will get to them as we can. So I am excited to introduce our guest speaker and collaborator on this workshop session, Jon Naranjo. He is currently NWF's Free, Prior, and Informed Consent Manager on our Tribal and Indigenous Partnership Enhancement Strategy team. So I'm officially going to pass it over to Jon to let him introduce himself and take us through the principles and practices of free, prior, and informed consent. So you can take it away, Jon.
Thank you, Samantha, and welcome. Good afternoon, all. I hope today finds you in good spirits and in good health. Today, I would like to speak to you on behalf of NWF's Free, Prior, and Informed Consent principles and guidelines, and to share a little bit of what I do and what Free, Prior, and Informed Consent is in regards to building partnerships with tribes across the country. My name is Jon Naranjo. I'm from Santa Clara Pueblo. I'm also a descendant of Hopi, and I currently live in Santa Clara Pueblo, which is located in New Mexico and is in the Rocky Mountain region for National Wildlife Federation. What is free, prior, informed consent, one might ask? Free, prior, informed consent is a specific and fundamental human right of Indigenous people. It is not simply a consultation process, but a right to give or withhold consent for any action that would affect their lands, territories, resources, or rights. This right is recognized in international law, most notably in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, otherwise known as UNDRIP. The core components are free, which is giving consent is given voluntarily and without coercion, intimidation, manipulation, or bribery. The process is self-directed by the Indigenous community and not bound by any external timelines. Prior, consent is sought sufficiently in advance of any activities being authorized or commenced, allowing Indigenous communities enough time to undertake their own decision-making processes. Informed, the Indigenous community is provided with objective, accurate, and comprehensive information about the proposed project. This includes potential positive and negative impacts, and is presented in a language and format they can easily understand. Consent is the collective decision made by Indigenous community according to their own customary decision-making processes. It is not about individual opinions, but the community's collective will. Consent can be given, withheld, or partially accepted, and the community has the right to change its mind throughout the project's lifespan. FPIC is a powerful expression of the right to self-determination and sovereignty for Indigenous peoples. It is a mechanism to ensure they have control over their lives and resources and that their inherent rights are respected. Here at the National Wildlife Federation, we have been able to implement what's called a Tribal Indigenous Partnership Enhancement Strategy, or TIPES, or TPs, just depending how you want to say it. We have a timeline that begins October of 2022. The Tribal and Indigenous Partnership Enhancement Strategy was adopted across the National Wildlife Federation. There was an independent study that was conducted by what was the Inclusive Community Consulting firm. And to the findings and the final reporting, the National Wildlife Federation extended this opportunity to implement the strategy. One of the core fundamental areas that we were able to establish was the passing of a resolution to adopt free, prior, informed consent in June of 2024 at the National Wildlife Federation annual meeting in Washington, D.C. as an organizational principle. August of 2024, guidelines for the application of free, prior, informed consent was released. And presently, we have projects underway nationally to advance tribal priorities and to understand environmental priorities across tribes. Implementing the principles of free, prior, informed consent in a predominantly white organization requires a deep commitment to decolonization, power sharing, and relationship building. While free, prior, informed consent is specifically about Indigenous peoples, the principles can be adapted to guide a more equitable and respectful approach to working with all communities of color, especially those who have been historically marginalized. Thank you. Free, Prior, Informed Consent Coalition was a organization that was finally brought together January of this past year. And in that regard, we were able to meet with other NGOs or non-government organizations, private sectors, such as the Wilderness Society, the National or the Nature Conservancy, the Wilderness Society Conservation, and among others. And so with the collective, we were able to make some advancements in what free, prior, informed consent may look like through an organization and helping to partner with tribes in hopes that we can advance free, prior, informed consent principles in conservation. Some of these ways that can be implemented and to support these principles is one, through education and internal transformation. Learn and understand. The first step is for everyone in your organization to understand what FPIC is, its historical content, and why it is a critical human right. This is not just for leadership, but for all staff, from project managers to administrative assistants. Acknowledge power dynamics. Your organization must recognize and actively address the power imbalances that exist. Some organizations often hold a position of power and privilege, and this must be acknowledged and worked through in every interaction with communities of color. We have to decolonize our practices and critically examine our organization's missions, values, and practices. Are we working on behalf of communities or with them? Do we assume we know what is best for a community, or do we let them lead? So shifting our mindset from a savior to an expert role to one of a partner and ally is a best practice. And these are some steps that we're working on taking in best practices here at the National Wildlife Federation. And so in doing so, we've been able to create a policy and framework And now we're developing an internal policy on free, prior, informed consent and community engagement. And in creating in collaboration with community partners and should be regularly reviewed, shifting from consultation to consent. Which prioritizing relationship building is really important and based on mutual respect. Before any project is even conceived, invest time and resources in building genuine long-term relationships with communities and their leaders. This isn't about getting a signature, it's about mutual respect. This can mean attending community events, listening to their priorities, and learning about their history and culture. Let communities define the process. The P in FPIC stands for prior, and this is where most organizations fail. Our organization is showing up with a prepackaged plan and can ask for a rubber stamp, but instead, we're engaging with communities at the very beginning of an idea and letting them define the process of engagement with a timeline and the decision-making process for the tribes. Here's a picture of a corn. There's a story that coincides here with our phases of the free, prior, informed consent process. And so with the corn story, in some pueblos and tribes in the Southwest, this is a reflection of our life. As the seed is planted into the ground, it is symbolizing that of an infant in the womb. And as it begins to grow inside the womb and expand, eventually the cornstalk breaks through the ground and comes into this earth where it is looked at as an infant. As it continues to grow, the various stages of life continue. Toddler, preteen, young adult, midlife, and then an elder. But in these various stages, there's a lot of different variables that occur as well. Weeds potentially grow, encroach on taking supplements from the plant, so those have to be removed. It has to be protected from creatures, squirrels, crows, maybe even elk or deer or livestock at that, maybe even just kids playing. But to nurture a plant or a human at that, or wildlife nurturing its young, there's a form of protection, there's sustenance that needs to be given to the plant. And in this particular picture, this corn was a sweet corn that was planted by my grandson, and he watered it day in and day out. He pulled the weeds. We sang to it. We laughed around it. We talked to it. And it grew and it provided the fruit of the labor, an ear of sweet corn. And so in the work that was provided, the care and the protection and the nurturing made all the difference. And so sharing this story with him, he may not quite understand at his age right now, but eventually as he gets older, he may understand the importance of the relationship.
John, shall I go to the slide about the FPIC, this slide, or would you like to?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that perfect. We have what's called the 4 phases of FPIC. And phase 1 is laying the groundwork, and such as, well, let's begin at phase 4. It's representing a seed in the picture. And during this phase, we're sharing with one another these seeds to plant. As this could be a project, a community project, a project within the organization with a potential partner. As we move into phase 1, we're laying the groundwork. And by this time, the seed has germinated. And so, as a commitment from to free prior informed consent as a team with a partner, a tribal partner, or a community partner, such as the Mayors for Monarchs, identify impacted Native and Indigenous communities and find points of contact and start including them and start engaging work with them. During phase 2, as we connect, make our assessments, and design the process together, we're continuously engaging and reaching out to Native and Indigenous communities, collectively assessing the impact and determining the process for consent. And if we're working with tribes more specifically, then we're allowing them to determine and dictate how this project's going to go. We're not going to go in and tell them this is what's going to happen. We allow them to make those decisions, and we can offer technical assistance or other forms of assistance that may need be. However, if we're a private organization and we're out there engaging, this is being respectful, learning about the culture and tradition, learning their language, even their history, and hoping that we can include Native and Indigenous communities as a part of some of these projects. Phase 3 shows a mature corn stalk, and this is a point where the project has been implemented and we're continuing to monitor the progress. And so at this point, there's a discussion and arrive at a community decision, monitor the alignment with free prior informed consent agreement, and adapt as necessary. And from there, it moves back into phase 4, where we can learn and continue to improve on rebuilding other relationships and sharing some of the seeds of knowledge, of wisdom that we've learned from this particular work. And as the cycle continues, this is the design that we had created for this particularly. And when we allow communities to define the process, then there's ownership that is become apparent. So what we do is provide accessible and transparent information. When proposing a project, we provide relevant information in a format that is culturally and linguistically appropriate. This may mean creating visual presentations using non-technical language, or providing information through community liaisons or trusted local organizations. Be honest about both the potential benefits and risks. Respect the no. The most critical aspect of free prior informed consent is respecting a community's decision to say no or to ask for significant changes. Consent is not a foregone conclusion. If a community withholds consent, our organization or your organization must be prepared to stop or significantly alter the project. This is a non-negotiable part of the process. Some practical steps for daily work: hire and retain staff of color. This is not just about diversity, it's about bringing in lived experience and cultural competency or awareness. However, be careful not to place the burden of representing an entire community on one person. Review our grant and funding processes. If we are funding a funding organization, examine our grant application process. Are our forms or requirements accessible? Do we require communities to conform to our organizational language or metrics? Share resources and platforms. Use our organizational resources platform to amplify the voices and work for community-led organizations. This can mean sharing funding opportunities, providing warm introductions to donors, or highlighting their work in your communication. And one thing that I might stress here is building relationships takes time, and it just doesn't happen over a phone call or an email or over a couple of Zoom meetings. We have to engage in person, in presence of one another, because there is a difference between being in the moment versus through a lens. And so that's really authentic, and that's meeting halfway, and that's being respectful and resourceful at the same time. As we listen more and talk less in meetings and collaborations with community partners, a simple but powerful practice is to listen more than we speak. As questions and then be silent, create space for community leaders to lead the conversation and set the agenda. Provide fair compensation. If we are asking community members to participate in a meeting or a project, they should be compensated for their time and expertise. This is not just a polite gesture, it's an act of acknowledging their value and honor and labor. Implementing the principles of free, prior, informed consent is a long-term commitment that requires humility, courage, and willingness to cede power. It's a journey of unlearning and rebuilding relationships based on mutual respect and genuine partnership, rather than a top-down model. So with that, it is important to understand some of the other issues as well, like a low difference to a high difference, the spectrum of engagement. Low difference is possibly just sending an email and hoping the community member or the tribal representative receives it and is aware of all the information. We have to continue to ensure that we have contact with individuals with tribal representation and speaking to the project or the actions that are in question, and not just minimizing some of the issues, but taking into full consideration the entire gamut, maybe even meeting for coffee or a snack, taking a walk, looking at potential site visits of particular project areas, learning about the history, asking, what's allowed. Each tribe or tribal community are different, and that's what makes them unique. Their language, their culture, their tradition, their ways of connecting. And so it's really important to understand some of these things, and being respectful and understanding in its full consideration the time that it's going to take to build these relationships. In doing so, um, some of the issues that are stemming from the Tribal Indigenous Partnership Enhancement Strategy is some of the things that we like to promote is the core values of water protection, intergenerational knowledge, and food sovereignty. And with that being said, um, contributing to some of the work that we're involved in uh, is really important to continue to build these connections and networking with a variety of different organizations. And there's a variety of different issues that are stemming right now. And so with that being said, uh, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone that become has come and joined us today for this. And I hope that this has helped you with a little bit more of an understanding how some of free prior informed consent can be applied in the daily objectives, programming, projects stemming that will be long term, short term. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at tipes@nwf.org. And again, it stands for Tribal and Indigenous Partnership Enhancement Strategy. It's been my pleasure, and thank you for your time and your efforts put forth and all the work that you do. And with all due respect, may this carry you forward with better understanding. And I hope that in the work that you're providing your communities may continue in good health. And thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate all that you brought to us today and kind of even sharing the example of, building the relationship with the land through your grandson. I really appreciate hearing about that. And I hope folks definitely do take up on the offer. And if you have resources to share or want to collaborate, again, definitely reach out to us. And thanks for folks who are putting stuff into the chat. We're going to review those and get to those soon. And we are going to transition to the workshop portion of our webinar. So we're using this activity that we've come up with to kind of apply practically what John has introduced to us today, the principles of free, prior, and informed consent and its value and significance to Indigenous communities. So in a moment, I'm going to pass the mic to Anjali, who is going to lead us through our workshop. So we are going to be using the framework of FPIC and the 4 phases of FPIC implementation to brainstorm how the city of St. Paul, Minnesota should move forward with planting a pollinator garden on Indigenous land. So St. Paul, Minnesota has actually been working with the National Wildlife Federation for a couple of years now, particularly through our Mayor's Monarch Pledge program. So the mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota, Melvin Carter, has been a signatory of the Mayor's Monarch Pledge program for many years. They've actually reached our leadership level designation, which recognizes their outstanding commitments to monarch and pollinator conservation. And they've been able to maintain that status for 4 years in a row. So in May 2025, the city of St. Paul adopted the recommendations of the state's tribal historic preservation officers to rename two culturally significant and sacred Dakota sites in the city. In May, the Indian Mounds Regional Park was officially renamed to be Wichahapi. This action reflects the city's commitment to preserving Indigenous heritage and strengthening its long-standing partnership with Dakota leaders and communities. The city collaborated with a lot of different partners, but I specifically want to shout out Walk On Teepee. They are an Indigenous-led environmental nonprofit that are based in the area, and they were really close conservation partners in making this happen. We're going to talk about them a little bit at the end. So when the city of St. Paul established the previously known as Indian Mounds Regional Park in 1892, they didn't understand, consider, or necessarily value at the time that this landscape had been a sacred site and a place of burial for Indigenous peoples for over 1,000 years. The Indigenous burial ground of Wichahapi is significant to Indigenous peoples as a cemetery where their ancestors are buried. It is home to the only known remaining burial mounds within the Minneapolis-St. Paul urban core. It's a place of reverence, remembrance, respect, and prayer to the living ancestors that exist in the area. So, the city's Mayor's Monarch Pledge team, led by the St. Paul Parks and Recreation Department, let us know at NWF that they are brainstorming planting a garden at the newly named Wichahapi landscape to fulfill action number 12 of the Mayor's Monarch Pledge. So action number 12 of the Mayor's Monarch Pledge asks community leaders to plant or restore a monarch and pollinator-friendly demonstration garden at City Hall or another prominent culturally significant community location. So to embrace the values of conservation, environmental justice, and the rights of Indigenous people, the St. Paul Mayor's Monarch Pledge planning team began brainstorming what it would look like planting a new pollinator garden at the Wichahapi landscape. So the city hasn't started this project, but the proposed idea is going to serve as the backdrop of our workshop for today. So I'm going to officially pass it over to Anjali, who's going to reintroduce our workshop a little bit and take everyone through it. So thanks so much, Anjali.
Yeah, thanks so much, Samantha. So as Samantha already mentioned, we're going to now ask all of you to apply the framework of free, prior, and informed consent to help the city of St. Paul move forward with planting a pollinator garden at Wichahapi. So to do this, we are going to go through the 4 phases of FPIC implementation one by one. I'm going to read aloud the relevant question and all of the actions that you have the option to take for each phase. I'm then going to launch a Zoom poll, and you all will have 45 seconds to select the actions that you would like to take. After those 45 seconds, I will close the poll, and then we'll go through why each action was either incorrect or correct. So we do want to preface this exercise by saying that while we're grounding this workshop in a real-life project example, all the scenarios and actions presented throughout this workshop are fictionalized just for learning purposes, and they don't necessarily reflect all the efforts that have been taken by the city of St. Paul. So before we get into the questions, I want to provide a quick refresher of the 4 phases of FPIC implementation that Jon took us through. So the first phase is laying the groundwork, which involves committing to FPIC as a team and identifying impacted communities and points of contact. The second phase is connecting, assessing, and designing a process, which involves reaching out to these contacts and collaboratively assessing impact and creating a process for consent. The third phase is implementing and monitoring, which involves reaching a community decision, monitoring alignment with FPIC, and adapting if necessary. And then the fourth and final phase is learning and improving, which involves summarizing your learning and sharing that with your team and other partners. So now we're going to ask you all to envision yourself as a member of the team leading the effort to plant a pollinator garden at Wichahapi, utilizing the 4 phases of FPIC implementation. So how are you going to lay the groundwork for this project? Do you visit the site to determine where a garden should be located? Do you research local Indigenous communities using only government documents and academic research to ensure information is accurate? Do you gather your team to develop a project budget and timeline that factors in FPIC? Or do you gather information on Native and Indigenous communities with ancestral or current ties to the project land, ecosystem, or topic? So again, once I launch the Zoom poll, you all will have 45 seconds to select what actions you'd like to take for phase 1. And please note that you can select more than one action. So in other words, more than one action can be correct. So with that, I'm going to quickly launch our first poll. Great, so it should be available now, and feel free to select your actions. Right, I'm going to end the poll now. Share the results. So we can see we have a little bit of distribution here. Definitely a lot of folks selected the last option, which is great. So if you did select the last 2 options, you would be correct. At this stage, you really want to be focused on, of course, laying the groundwork to guarantee that FPIC is incorporated into all aspects of the project and ensuring that your entire team is committed to the principles of FPIC. You also want to be focused on identifying all communities that could possibly be impacted by the project. Doing this baseline research before reaching out to anyone will help you avoid placing the burden of basic education onto community members. And the second option, which a few folks chose, might seem correct at first, but you do not want to rely solely on academic research and government documents for your research. So these can be important sources, but you should also look at local tribe websites, recent news articles, blogs, video essays, and more. Using a wide array of diverse sources for your research is just going to help to ensure that you don't miss any important information. And government documents and academic research have not always been inclusive of Indigenous knowledge. So looking at materials created by Indigenous communities will be really important. And finally, it is a little bit too early in the process to be identifying a planting site because consent from communities should be sought before planning and finalizing these kinds of project logistics. So I'm just going to go over a couple more key considerations for phase 1. It can be challenging to identify who is authorized to speak for a community because each community has its own governance and representation structures. Common contexts you can look for include tribal chairpersons, presidents, elected representatives, and elders or spiritual leaders. Also, when consulting community representatives, as John mentioned earlier, you should consider appropriate compensation for their time and knowledge, because Indigenous peoples are often solicited for information, which does take time and emotional and intellectual effort. So you should ensure that this compensation is part of your project budget and is communicated upfront. And finally, it's really important to recognize that Indigenous partners will have their own timelines and priorities, and therefore the FPIC process will need to include some flexibility, humility, and openness. So now that we've completed phase 1, we're going to move on to phase 2. So after researching Indigenous communities with ancestral or current ties to land, your team determines that Wichahapi has deep significance to the Upper Sioux community, the Lower Sioux community, the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community, the Prairie Island Indian community, the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin, Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate. So you identify who is authorized to speak for each of these communities, and then you connect with them. So now that you've reached out to all of the relevant individuals from each community, how are you going to assess impact and establish a process? Do you schedule listening sessions with Native and Indigenous community members to determine potential impacts the project will have on community lands, livelihoods, and cultural well-being? Do you reach out to Native and Indigenous community leaders and ask them to review a project plan within a week? Do you research funding opportunities, develop a process for sourcing materials, and start recruiting volunteers for a planting day? Or do you utilize information from community meetings to create a timeline, budget, list of necessary parties, and a dispute resolution process for the project? So for the sake of time, we're going to give folks 30 seconds to select their actions for this phase. And again, please remember that you can select more than one action. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our second poll here. Great. Okay, so the 30 seconds is up. We'll go ahead and share our results. So as you can see, if you picked the first and last option, you would be correct. And a lot of folks did that, so that's awesome. So for this phase, after connecting with relevant communities, you want to schedule time with community members to determine potential impacts the project will have on community lands, livelihoods, and cultural well-being. While assessing these potential impacts and benefits to any affected communities, it's important to incorporate Indigenous knowledge, which is knowledge held by the community on culturally significant lands, practices, ecological patterns, and more. One way to listen for traditional knowledge is through participatory mapping. We're not going to get into that during this workshop, but you can learn a little bit more about participatory mapping through the FAO e-learning academy. And we should be able to put a link to this resource either in the chat or in the resource function of this workshop. So another thing to note is that the process of learning from Indigenous communities is going to take some time, so it's important to account for this in your project planning. And then once these listening sessions are complete, you can then utilize all that you've learned from community members to then create a timeline, budget, list of necessary parties, and dispute resolution process. So the second action listed here is not recommended because consent needs to be given without externally placed deadlines. So as I mentioned previously, Indigenous partners are going to have their own timelines and priorities. So a week may not really be enough time for a community to review a plan and come to a decision. It would be much better to collaboratively determine a timeline for reviewing plans or really for all aspects of a project. And the third option is also not recommended because, again, you don't want to start planning project logistics without seeking consent first. So this really speaks to the prior and free prior and informed consent, which means that a decision is sought at the initial stages of program planning, well before program activities like obtaining funding and recruiting volunteers have begun. Great, so that is the end of phase 2, and now we're moving on to phase 3. So at this stage, you have identified some key partners for this project. Also, during listening sessions, these partners and community leaders voice their excitement about the planting project. So you go ahead and draft an initial project plan using all the insight you gained from the listening sessions and present it to the leaders. After reviewing the project plan, the communities do not consent to the proposed planting site and ask that the garden be moved to another location within Wichahapi. So now for phase 3, how are you going to negotiate and arrive at a community decision? Do you respect this decision and alter your project plan to plant the garden at the site identified by the communities? Do you host a meeting to explain why your team believes a garden should be planted at the original site and then put it up to a final vote? Or do you send an email to community leaders informing them that you are going to continue with the original project plan because they already expressed approval for the project during the listening sessions? So again, once I launch the poll, you're going to have 30 seconds to select your actions. Great, that is 30 seconds. So we had a lot of consensus on this one, which is great because the first answer is the correct answer. So you should always respect a community's decision, even if it impacts your project and you have to change course. So a project really should never continue as planned without consent. The second option is not correct because consent needs to be given free of coercion or manipulation. If a community says no to an aspect of a project, it is really not appropriate to pressure them to change that decision. And the third option is not correct because consent is not permanent and it requires ongoing monitoring, especially as new information arises or as conditions change. So in other words, consent can be removed at any time and it is important to adjust accordingly. So I think one of the key takeaways from this workshop is that, as Jon mentioned, relationship building takes time. So regardless of the outcome of the negotiation process, you should approach community interactions with the mindset of an ongoing relationship that is going to surpass any one singular project. So I think it's important to really be focused on taking actions that are going to help you build and maintain good relationships and not just to achieve project goals. Right, so that is the end of phase 3. We're moving on to our last phase. So the communities do end up providing consent for the final project plan after the location is changed and a garden is planted at Wichahapi. So the planting may be complete, but the FPIC implementation process is not. How do you learn and improve from this process? Do you ask your team members to reflect on the process? Do you develop a written summary of actions that contributed to protecting affected communities' self-determination or those that need improvement? Do you conclude that if a planting occurred, then there is no need to reflect on the process because the project was a success? Or do you develop a communication plan to better explain the benefits of future projects to ensure that communities give their consent? So again, you're going to have 30 seconds to answer the question, and you can select more than one option. Great, that is 30 seconds. So as you can see, the first two options were the correct answers, which most people selected. So that's great. So asking your team to reflect on the process is going to ensure that they learn from successes and mistakes and can improve in the future. And creating a written summary might take a little bit more time, but recording these reflections is going to make it a lot easier to reference and to share with other members of your team or partners. And this second option is not correct because successfully incorporating FPIC into a project is not about achieving the original objectives of a project. Success is really about protecting all affected communities' self-determination. And reflecting on this is going to ensure that you continue to improve your ability to do this in future projects. And of course, the last option is incorrect because, again, consent should be given without any sort of coercion. Great, so you all have made it through the 4 phases of FPIC implementation. So we are going to have one final bonus question, which is going to be rapid fire and just an opportunity to kind of reflect on, an opportunity to practice reflecting on a project. So you may remember that Jon touched briefly on the spectrum of engagement. So we'd like you all to determine where on the spectrum of engagement does this particular fictionalized project land? Is it on the lower end of the spectrum or on the higher end? So I'm going to put up our final poll here. And because it's rapid fire, we're going to give you all about 15 seconds to answer this bonus question. And that is time. Okay, a lot of folks did say that it was on the higher end. Our team did determine that this project was actually on the lower end because project ideas and goals were conceptualized prior to connecting with the impacted communities. But we want to encourage everyone to continue reflecting on this at home. So definitely take some time to think about what your project team could have done differently to improve this project. And yeah, so with that, we want to thank you all so much for participating in our workshop today. I am going to hand it back to Samantha to wrap us all up. While she is doing that, we still encourage you all to think about one lesson that you're going to leave this webinar with, and share it in the chat if you would like to. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Samantha.
Thank you so much, Anjali. I think that was a perfect session to be able to kind of like really think through some of the topics that we've talked about today. So yeah, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. We appreciate that you chose to spend your time with us. We hope that through this session, you'll leave here knowing that Indigenous peoples have centuries of knowledge of land protection and are conservationists' most logical first partners. Free, prior, and informed consent ensures that tribes are brought into the table with mutual respect. And the FPIC model gives you a place to start and really can be applied to nearly any relationship that you're working on. So I want to leave you all with some resources so you can continue your education on free, prior, and informed consent and Indigenous communities. So first, I encourage you guys to read more about the renaming of Wichahapi and the community partners, specifically the nonprofits, the Indigenous-led nonprofits that made that happen. So we'll highlight that in the resources tab for you in a moment. Yesterday was also Indigenous Peoples Day, and so we want to uplift the work of Indigenous partners that are working across the country and leading really important work in areas such as access to clean water, water rights, wildlife connectivity across tribal lands. And so we encourage you to take the time to read this blog that will show up in the resources tab. And we hope that this introduction to free, prior, and informed consent has inspired you to continue learning about these principles and practices. We encourage you to check out the training course that Anjali mentioned earlier, which is in the resources tab. We also encourage you to consider reading the UN's FPIC manual for project practitioners. There is also a free online tribal engagement series that is built with natural resource practitioners in mind. So you have access to that free training, and we put that in the resources as well. So I want to end here today and thank you all for continuing with us. And I want to kind of give a plug for if you're looking for ways to get involved in a deeper level where you live. We encourage you to pursue local environmental projects through community wildlife habitat. Our Mayor's Monarch Pledge program will be, sorry, I did that backwards. Our Mayor's Monarch Pledge program will be accepting pledges this year starting December 1st. So we encourage folks to stay in contact with us and getting their local leaders engaged in monarch conservation. And then if you are interested in advancing monarch community conservation projects on the ground, we encourage you to check out our Community Wildlife Habitat program. So that is all that I have for us today. Again, thank you everyone for joining, and we will be sending out the recording and some of the resources to everyone who attended today. So thank you all so much.